You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the founder and owner of Provenance hotels, lifestyle boutique hotels across the United States. In 2018, he was appointed by President Trump as the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, and just recently has published a book, The Envoy, Mastering the Art of Diplomacy with Trump and the World. Ambassador Sondland, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nice to see you, Jim.
Let's start off talking about the European Union. That was obviously your posting. It's obviously the major U.S. partner in the world. What were the issues and priorities you had when you were ambassador?
One of the largest issues at the time, and still is today, was trade. Not just the trade deficit and dealing with the reasons behind the trade deficit, but also with the EU's desire to sort of have regulatory supremacy. They really wanted to set the rules and have us follow those rules. Some of that was actually our own fault because we allowed them to do it. The Trump policy at the time was to identify points of leverage in order to use those points of leverage to get the European Union, for lack of a better descriptor, to behave the way we wanted them to, given the fact that multiple presidents over the years had tried the nice way and it didn't seem to be working.
When you say issues, are these trade issues or issues beyond trade?
Well, the trade issues themselves are a fairly, holistic subject. They include taxation. They include regulatory issues with respect to data, with respect to safety, with respect to geographic origin for agriculture. There's just a whole host of them. And, we didn't really have what I would say is a goodwill account with the EU. And what I mean by that, Ambassador, is we basically wrote the checks, spilled the blood, and helped Europe get rebuilt after World War II. And you would think that even though we haven't asked for repayment in the classic sense, we would at least have a goodwill account with the Europeans, and they would treat us differently than they would a, quote, normal trading partner. In other words, to give us a special category and treat us the way you would treat a friend who's done you many, 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 many favors. And the reality was they don't, and they never have. It's sort of, what have you done for us today? And I think President Trump, whether you're a fan or you don't like him, quickly zeroed in on that issue and tried to identify areas of leverage, including tariffs, including reciprocal regulations when they tried to get a little heavy-handed, to bring them back to the table and say, look, this isn't acceptable running, $150 or $200 billion trade deficit with you.
Let me ask you this, which of those issues during the time you were ambassador do you think you made some progress on, which some you probably didn't make as much progress as you'd like to?
Well, we closed a few deals, the way I like to say it, where we were able to get, for example, the German automobile manufacturing sector. We sort of went around the EU, went directly to the German car makers and asked them to invest directly in US infrastructure and jobs and produce more cars in the United States. And the only thing that brought them to the table and made them agree to do that was the fact that we were threatening tariffs on German cars, which would have essentially put them out of business had President Trump followed through on his threat. It wasn't a nice way to do things, but frankly, it was an effective way to do things. And they were more than happy to consider significant investment in southeastern United States. And they, in fact, made commitments to that effect.
Have those commitments been followed through on yet, or what's the status?
They were being followed through on throughout the Trump administration, even through the end where the impeachment occurred and so on and so forth. I haven't followed through, but my guess is there was largely an additional investment over and above what they would have done without the threats put in.
Mhm. What would be an example of where you all made efforts, but you didn't make much progress? What were the really tough nuts?
Well, one of the tough nuts was agriculture. They just have a very, very protectionist attitude on agriculture. They have a lot of small farmers who lovingly grow their tomatoes that are beautiful and red and organic, and they don't want to see genetically modified tomatoes that aren't as pretty as theirs sitting on the shelves next to theirs in a French supermarket, for example. And our point was, well, why don't you let us do it? And if the consumers don't like our tomatoes, they won't buy them. They'll rot on the shelves. And then it's our problem, not yours. You've given us access to the market. You've allowed us to price according to what our costs are. And if we can't succeed in your market, then no harm, no foul. Then that's our problem. We have to produce a prettier tomato than you. And their answer was interesting. They said, our people rely on us to make those decisions. We don't even want to present them with those options because we want them to know that anything on those shelves, meets a certain standard, which is not your standard. So it was a very, very sort of, thumb in the nose kind of a response. But that was one that was extraordinarily difficult.
One of the issues that we see in NATO, but I presume you see it in the EU as well, is differences in priorities between the Central and Eastern European countries and the Western European countries. How did that play out in the EU issues, the economic issues, the trade issues, and so forth? Do you see that kind of division between Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, or not so much?
The Eastern Europeans are far more pragmatic deal makers. They sort of get to the bottom line much more quickly. What's in it for you? What's in it for us? How do we make a deal? The Western Europeans are far more opaque, and they always want their cake and eat it too, and take your cake on top of it. So it's very, very problematic. Where this really sort of was exposed was the French, primarily the French during the JCPOA withdrawal.
What is the JCPOA?
The JCPOA is the acronym. I'm sorry for using all these acronyms because
you were in Brussels. You have to use acronyms.
Exactly. I'd be laughed out of the room without an acronym. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. What a stupid name for the Iran nuclear deal. I don't know who named it, but that's the name. JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Anyway, the Trump administration made their strategic decision that the Iranians were violating the agreement anyway. They were on their way to 90+% enrichment. They had a lot of stuff going on that's classified, but that wasn't in our interest. And the Trump decided to withdraw from that agreement and to sanction the Iranians because his sort of simplistic view was when you crunch them on their cash flow and they don't have cash flow, they're too poor to create mischief and they can't enrich uranium if they're broke. And there was some logic to that. He had their oil exports down by almost 80% at one point, and they were definitely showing signs of wanting to talk. Unfortunately, the French said, we have business with Iran that we don't want to give up. So they created this sort of workaround to the sanctions called Instex, which was just another fancy way of bartering with the Iranians so that they could avoid our financial institution sanctions. And we had to go to bat and basically tell the French, look, you can do business with the US, you can do business with Iran, but you can't do business with both. So decide what you want to do because we'll sanction you now. And all of a sudden, Instex sort of, they never actually abandoned it, but the level of activity dropped to almost zero. So they got the message.
Oh, interesting. Well, in addition to the sort of regular EU issues that we're talking about, you played quite a visible role in relations with Ukraine. You tell that story in the book. If you how did you get involved with Ukraine, and what were the high points and low points of your involvement with Ukraine?
Well, the low point was getting fired after the impeachment. I think President Trump didn't want anyone around remotely connected with the impeachment hearing because he didn't want the media to keep dredging it back up again, as if that would have made any difference. But, you know, a week or 2 weeks before, I was complimented on my work. And then once the impeachment hearing was over, I was out. But what got me involved in Ukraine, the press narrative was that I sort of went off on my own and decided to basically get out of my lane and deal with Ukraine, where I had no business with Ukraine since it's not an EU country. And the reality is that the career folks at the State Department, early on in my preparation and my briefings, said Ukraine is a very important part of your portfolio. And I said, why is that? And they said, the reason is you need to bring Europe and the US together on Ukraine policy so there's no daylight. Because when the Russians see that there's no daylight between the US and Ukraine, then all of a sudden it becomes a big threat and they leave Ukraine alone. And of course, I'm being very simplistic in that explanation, but that's essentially it. So very early on, before I sort of set my own meetings, as I was learning and working my way through, my career staff recommended a meeting. I think it was within the first couple of weeks of me taking post, with the foreign minister of Ukraine. And I met with that foreign minister, Pavlo Klimkin at the time, and he said, look, we're being viewed as corrupt. We can't get true Western investment. No one wants to play ball because they think we're a cesspool. And those are my words, not his, but I think it accurately describes, the feeling. And I said, well, listen, you guys need to clean up your act. You need to bring in American advisors, investment banks, and do what they tell you to do in terms of cleaning up your boards, your balance sheets, so that you look legitimate to Western investors. And the minute you do that, and this can be done quickly, this doesn't have to take years, it could be done in months. The minute you start to look good to Western investors, they'll come and put money in. People want to invest in Ukraine. So they went back and started working on that. So that was one of my first initiatives with Ukraine, was simply trying to help them get rid of the corruption optic. And then one thing led to another. I led a delegation of Europeans in February of 2019, before Zelenskyy was elected, while Poroshenko was still president. We gave fairly tough speeches in Odessa. The Russians definitely heard our speeches. They weren't happy about them because they don't like when the US and the EU act in concert. It's very threatening to the Russians when they see no daylight between us. They love to exploit differences. So that was one of the other initiatives. And then, of course, Zelenskyy won, Poroshenko lost, and we went to the inauguration, and I guess the rest is history.
Well, some of it's history, but some of it's more interesting than others in the sense that you talk about this event that you hosted with Zelenskyy in Brussels.
Yeah, in the Envoy, I went into a little bit of an explanation. I decided after having met Zelenskyy that he would be a very, very effective ambassador, not just a leader, but an ambassador for his country, even though he obviously had ambassadors. And I decided that the easiest and quickest way to bring he and the Europeans together would be to host an event in Brussels. Again, very, it was definitely a counterintuitive type of thing. The professionals, the staff, the career folks did not like it at all. They didn't like anything about it because it totally violated all the norms.
How so?
Well, I invited multiple foreign leaders. I basically lied to all of them and said, so-and-so is coming and is looking forward to seeing you. And then I call the other foreign leader and say, so-and-so is coming and looking forward to seeing you. And that's the only way you get these people, because they don't want to show up and have a bunch of lowly ambassadors and, assistant secretaries there when they're the leader of their country. So, the white lies paid off. We got a pretty good crowd. We had the president of Poland, we had the prime minister of Georgia, we had the prime minister of Romania. We had a lot of people there. And I made it very informal. I asked everyone to call everyone else by their first name at the table, which again, the career people started to roll their eyes. And
how successful were you in getting people to use their first names?
Immediately. It was almost like a relief. I also made them give each other their cell phone numbers. And that drove the staff crazy, because at the end of the dinner, they all went off into corners and started exchanging all kinds of other information. They promised to call each other directly. And it sort of brought this whole, and I had a few, people from the administration there as well. I had the counselor to the secretary, Jared Kushner came. I had some military folks there. And it was like one big family dinner, which is what I was trying to orchestrate. And of course, the protocol people all went nuts. They were all excluded from the planning process because I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do was sort of mission accomplished. And I believe truly that Zelenskyy meeting Andrzej Duda at that dinner, and I sat them near each other.
I'm sorry, and Andrzej Duda is?
Andrzej Duda is the president of Poland.
Thank you.
I believe that paid off in spades over time in terms of their relationship, particularly post-invasion.
Interesting. So what is your view of what's happened in Ukraine since you left post and where we are right now? Because you obviously know a lot about Ukraine, you know a lot about the European Union, you know a lot about these issues. What's your impression of what's happened with Russia's invasion?
Well, simplistically, and I've been very public, I am not supporting President Trump for re-election. I don't, and that's a whole other subject. I don't believe that he should be able to stand for re-election given what happened on January 6th. So my comments about, his strategy are more about the strategy than the person. And I want everyone to take it in that context. But I can tell you, I believe that Putin would have been off kilter and frightened enough of what crazy things that Trump might do to him that Putin likely would not have invaded Ukraine under Trump. Now, obviously, I can't predict that with certainty, but I do believe that President Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan and something that was covered by the media but did not get the emphasis that it needed, which was a comment President Biden made about potentially accepting a minor incursion into Ukraine, which I think spoke volumes to Putin about Biden's willingness to defend Ukraine. I think Putin's default setting under Trump, under Biden, under Obama, under Bush, his default setting was always to invade Ukraine and to keep invading Ukraine until he owned Ukraine. I think the only thing stopping him was when could he get away with it? And I don't believe at the end of the day, his calculus was, given the national security team under Trump and given Trump's unpredictability, that he felt he could get away with it under Trump. I do believe he felt he could get away with it under Biden. And that's why he did what he did. So fast forward, we're now in this. Biden has done a credible job of bringing the European Union to the table and showing some amount of unity. I do think, however, that this is an existential fight, not just for Ukraine, but as the doorstep to Europe for a lot of the other Eastern countries. And I do think that we now need to drop this pretense of escalation and of nuclear war. I think the nuclear card is being overplayed, frankly. And I think we need to give the Ukrainians very quickly what they need in order to allow them to go to the negotiating table. They're not ready. They haven't softened the, to use the B-52 carpet bombing, analogy, which is probably not a good analogy, but I'll use it anyway. They need to soften Putin up a lot more. They need to kill a lot more of his people and destroy a lot more of his weaponry before he's ready to have a true negotiation. And I think that negotiation needs to be basically the reclamation of all of Ukraine, including Crimea.
A lot of people were surprised that right after the invasion on February 24th, the Europeans came together so strongly and quickly with the US. Knowing them as you do, was that a surprise to you too, or not?
It was a shock. because, as you know, Ambassador, many things in Europe require unanimity, not a majority, not even a qualified voting majority. They require complete unanimity.
Right.
And if you use our Congress as an analogy, can you imagine trying to get anything through either house of Congress with a unanimous vote, where one person, in this case, one country, can hold everything up? So getting the Europeans as far as they've gotten, I'll credit the Biden administration with some of that, but I'll also credit the Europeans with taking a very sober look at what's going on. I mean, this is really a threat to them as much as it is to us, if not more so.
Yeah, the Europeans I talk to think of it more as a threat to them. So they're a little closer.
Well, but we also know that, look, if we sat back and allowed Russia to do what Russia is capable of doing without our intervention, we'd have to pay the price at some point.
For sure.
The Atlantic Ocean is not going to protect us.
No, for sure. That's the whole strategy of transatlantic defense. So that makes perfect sense. We learned that in World War I and World War II.
Well, that's why I'm very dismayed by some of the voices on the Republican side. Hopefully they become fewer and fewer of sort of this isolationist move to say, look, we still have open borders. Why should we send money to Ukraine? And all of the things some of my friends on the far right are saying. I just don't buy the fact that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, I think the border issue in the United States is a legitimate issue and it should be dealt with, but that doesn't mean you let Ukraine go.
Let me touch on one last subject that you talk about in various ways in the book, and you mentioned the context of the family dinner party you had with the leaders of Europe when you were ambassador, is the difference in approaches of career diplomats and non-career diplomats. What would you say are the key differences that you noticed and feel are important?
Well, the career diplomats are absolute subject matter experts. They're rigorously trained. They really know their stuff. They dig deep into each issue and understand the history and why people behave the way they behave, given what's happened to them in the past. And a political appointee, while they will have a working knowledge of their country, they may even speak the language, they will never have the depth and breadth that a political or that a career person will have, because that's what a career person has prepared themselves for in 20, 25, 30 years, whatever it takes to become a career ambassador. So having that expertise, at your right knee is critical, but the ability to read a room, to make a deal, to say things to a foreign leader, to another ambassador that a career person might hesitate to say, to be able to pick up the phone and call the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the President, the Vice President directly without going through the chain of command, those are invaluable tools in a diplomat's quiver. And frankly, when you look at some of the other countries with whom we have bilateral relations, and you see a lot of their career people, because that's always the excuse that's thrown back at us, and say, well, we're the only country that has political appointees like we do. Most countries have career people. But those foreign services are much, much smaller than ours, even with some fairly big countries. And those people have the access that our career people don't, because there are not that many layers between the ambassador and the leader of the country. And those ambassadors know their leaders well. They spend time with their leaders. They have access to their leaders. And so it's a completely different, paradigm than ours.
That's a very interesting insight. I will say, when I was ambassador to Romania, there was one other non-career ambassador who was the Portuguese ambassador. And he had been a leader as a student in the student movement to overthrow the dictatorship in Portugal, and became a leader in the Social Democratic Party in Portugal. And he was education minister and all these things. And by the time I met him, he was ambassador to Romania. And so it was interesting to see a European non-career ambassador, which is so unusual.
But had he been replaced by a career person in that role, knowing the Portuguese system, because my good friend was the US ambassador to Portugal, the Portuguese ambassador to Romania could easily pick up the phone and call the president of Portugal if he needed to.
Good point.
And the career person from the US in Romania, if you were replaced by a career person after your service was over, they couldn't call the president except in the most dire emergency.
Or if there was some relationship. I mean, there are a number of career ambassadors that I've known over the years who served in various positions and do have relationships. And specifically in the case of President Biden, I'm not telling any story that I don't know, but President Biden knows so many career people, so many non-career people, because he's been involved in foreign policy for so long. It may
President Biden, I have to agree with you, Jim. President Biden, the few people I know that are President Biden's career appointees do have the access, because many of them go back 20, 30, 40 years with President Biden personally. So they do have it, but that's an unusual situation.
Of course it is.
Very unusual. Yeah, but I would agree with that. I
understand. Ambassador Sondland, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ambassador. I really enjoyed it.
I have to say that whether you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, you're going to love this book. It's a great read, very interesting, very insightful. And a lot of times you just have a smile on your face. Sometimes a little more challenging than that. And he's talking about a lot of difficult issues, but it's a very good read. This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for American Ambassadors Live podcast.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.